Self-sabotage is when we say we want something and then go about making sure it doesn't happen. The concept of the shadow self has gripped our storytellers and movie stars since, well, Jekyll and Hyde, which was in the 1800s. There's just something about the story of hidden personality fragments taking control of us that we sort of intuitively understand. And despite this, or maybe even because of it, the shadow self is one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of popular psychology, but more on that later. For now, I want to explain what the shadow is and focus on answering the core question. Actually, there's a bunch of questions. Is my shadow me, or does it have a mind of its own? How can we integrate our shadows to become more than we are? And what has all of this got to do with self-sabotage? I used to consider the shadow to be kind of like Sonic, and I think this is the popular conception of it. You're the good and heroic Sonic, and you have this dark shadow Sonic that's hidden somewhere in the depths of your mind. And ever since I discovered the concept, I always wanted to integrate my shadow so that I could be more mysterious and cool. But it turns out I had completely misunderstood the entire concept. And it was this misunderstanding that caused me to go about trying to integrate my shadow in all of the most counterproductive ways, causing more self-sabotage and social anxiety than if I had never even heard of the concept at all. So if your shadow isn't some dark and mysterious version of you, then what is it? To understand that, you first need to stop seeing yourself as an individual. Instead, you are much more like a government. Bear with me, I'm pulling out the analogies for this one. As far as other countries are concerned, the US government is an individual entity. And as far as other people are concerned, you are an individual person. But inside the US government are over 90,000 governmental entities, many of which are quite independent and autonomous, each with their own specific tasks, beliefs, values, priorities, plans, and scope. Similarly, inside you are many psychological entities, many of which are quite independent and autonomous, each with their own specific tasks, beliefs, values, priorities, plans, and scope. Now, what would happen if the US government was to make, say, alcohol illegal? Well, in 1920, they did. And since alcohol was very much an inseparable part of the US, it didn't just disappear when they made it illegal. Instead, it went underground. Alcohol markets just emerged in the shadows outside of governmental view, completely unregulated and uncontrolled, unless you consider Al Capone to be a regulator. So taking our analogy, what would happen if you were to make, say, aggression illegal? That's to say, if you were to convince yourself that it was unacceptable to experience or express aggression. Well, since aggression is a part of you, it won't just disappear, it will go underground. Your aggression, and all of the parts of your personality capable of harnessing it, would also begin to operate from the shadows, outside of your view, unregulated and uncontrolled. This is what is meant by your shadow. It's simply all of the parts of yourself to which you are willfully blind. You can see how this could cause problems. Asking for a raise, a date, standing up for yourself, all these things are good things, and they all employ aggression to a greater or lesser extent. But by keeping the fragments of your personality that are capable of harnessing aggression in the shadow, you will never be able to call on those resources at will when it's appropriate. But more importantly than that, they will still be there. And you'll always be just one bad day away from a completely uncontrolled outburst where you slap your coworker. Maybe not that much, but there'll be something, and it'll be bad. And you'll be like, damn, I wish I watched more Angelo videos. But here's where the second misconception comes in. It's not only traditionally dark aspects of our personalities that we put in our shadow, like aggression, jealousy, and anger. It can just as often be things like creativity, love, or desire for interpersonal connection. For instance, say you've pushed your desire for social connection into your shadow, and as a result you fancy yourself as a bit of a lone wolf. In your current job, you work at an office, and so every day you're surrounded by people, and so you set a plan to get a high-paying coding job that you can work from home, where you won't have to deal with all those annoying humans every day. And as luck would have it, you land an interview for your dream work-from-home job, but you forget to prepare for the interview until the night before, and on the morning of the interview you just can't seem to find your car keys. That's weird, you say to yourself, I never lose my car keys. And then during the interview, you inexplicably forget almost everything that you know about coding. The information's there, you just can't bring it to the surface. How do we explain this? Well, by casting your desire for social connection outside of the conscious domain, it developed a will of its own and became a sort of sub-personality, or complex as Jung called it. And without oversight, operating from the shadows, these shadow selves find sneaky ways to get their needs met, by sabotaging the job interview that was going to lead to your isolation, for instance. Or perhaps you just have a repressed fear of success, and so whenever things start going well, you always seem to find a million problems with the path that you're on. All of this sounds very sucky. No one wants this. How do we fix it? How do we integrate our shadow and avoid all of that unnecessary self-sabotage? Which, to be honest, I think is responsible for the obituaries of more dreams than fear or laziness ever was. When lots of teenage boys encounter this idea of the shadow, myself included, their attempts to integrate it end up looking something like this. And I'm gonna stick to the government analogy for clarity's sake. They first imagine that whatever exists in their black markets, their shadow, must be powerful and mysterious and cool. Their government, persona, then begins trying to act more powerful, mysterious, and cool, in order to imitate what they had essentially just guessed was in their shadow. And they consider this to be a part of their efforts to integrate it. But they never actually end up bringing these black markets back into the light and regulating them. They just become a more confused government, and in their efforts often end up fragmenting their personality further and growing a bigger shadow. Why? Well, because their approach was tyrannical and motivated primarily by fear, which is the cause of the whole damn issue in the first place. If a government actually wants to become more powerful, it can't just imagine that it has more power than it does, or imitate its ideals while ignoring what's actually going on within the nation. It has to actually harness the various forces within the nation and get them to cooperate together towards a unified goal, like a magnifying glass taking a bunch of light and focusing it all in onto one point. But how do we actually discover and get to know those fragments of our personality that have been cut off from the whole? By definition, we aren't aware of them, and you don't know what you don't know. So it's tricky, and there is no step-by-step process. But here's some stuff that helped me. Firstly, introspection is necessary. You have to be willing to ask yourself why you behave in certain ways, and why you feel certain feelings, and why do you only feel those feelings in response to certain stimuli? There's patterns to these things. And of all of those questions, you have to actually want to know the answers, even if it's uncomfortable or undermines you, because undermining what you think is you is kind of the whole purpose of this endeavor. And so once you reach that state, that's half the job already done. The other half is attention. You have to be paying attention to the patterns of your actions, the patterns of your decision-making, the patterns of your emotions. What pisses you off? What makes you uncomfortable? What experiences do you avoid? Unfortunately, whatever is in your shadow is, almost by definition, precisely what you would least want to find there. So ask yourself, if you had a button that would reveal your shadow to you, what would you least want him to be like? What traits would you least want him to embody? What beliefs, goals, plans, and values would you least want him to have, considering that he is you? Now, those are probably some of the hardest questions in the world to answer honestly and accurately. Because the truth is, you probably don't actually want to know the answers. Because you know that you wouldn't like what those answers would imply about you. There's a reason you cut off those parts of yourself to begin with. So before you ask yourself these things, assume a state of genuine, gentle curiosity, and postpone your impulse to pass judgment onto yourself. And then, most importantly of all, listen. Listen to what arises in your mind and body. Don't think, don't strategize, don't reason, just listen. As if you were a tolerant king, inviting the outcasts of your soul to be granted a ceasefire and an audience with the committee of the self, so that they can voice their needs without being shunned. Whether or not those shadow selves accept the invite and reveal themselves depends largely on how earnest they believe the invite was, how honest they believe the invite was, whether they think you're actually willing to include their will into yours. If you're not genuine with your invitation, those shadow selves will know it, because they are you. The shit gets so meta. And they will know that they're better off just staying in the shadows, outside of the reach of the conscious mind, if they actually want to get their needs met, because you're not going to meet their needs for them. You wouldn't like what that would imply about you. Also, here's some more advice that I need to take myself. Meditate. Hope that helps, and stay real. Why did I do this?